Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to do this quick video to cover some of the topics that we didn't get to address last class. I'm going to try to keep this really short. I know it's a busy week and everyone just has a lot going on, but next week we'll start the topic of World War I. I don't see you in class tomorrow, so I thought in case you have an interest or just want to continue your notes for Teddy Roosevelt and imperialism, this is one additional case study or topic that you can put on the list. We did look at Teddy Roosevelt with a few different foreign policy topics. One was the introduction of the Panama Canal. We saw Teddy Roosevelt involved in a Panamanian revolution so that Panama could be separate than Colombia and then do an economic deal with the United States for the land for the Panama Canal. We also looked at the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is basically an extension or a tweaking, if you want to argue that, or maybe even a complete change of the Monroe Doctrine to one which is a lot more, kind of centered on the United States taking initiative in Latin America. And so this last topic relates a little bit more to some of the societies in Asia. Just remember the United States, of course, had annexed the Philippines as an unincorporated territory. So there's a lot of decisions related to that. Teddy Roosevelt does end the war in the Philippines, but of course there's still revolts that continue. But there's also been the open door notes in China at this point that we're going to be looking at in like 1904, 1905. We'll be looking at a war between Japan and Russia. And just keep in mind the open door notes and these spheres of influence in China, because both Russia and Japan and even the United States at this point have expressed interest in controlling some of the economic resources within China. And a lot of what is happening in this area is some imperialism on behalf of Japan, and then ultimately Russia too in the areas of China, Manchuria, and Korea. And so this war between Russia and Japan is really going to be a war where Japan would like to have its country involved in controlling specific resources in Manchuria, in China, and Korea. For example, Port Arthur, which we can see on the map, is a warm water port and very significant. There's a large-scale railroad that connects Port Arthur to other areas in Manchuria and then further. And Russia also has an interest in this warm water port, and Russia has also been moving into areas of Korea. Japan will initiate the Russo-Japanese War largely because of trying to remove Russia as a presence over land that Japan sees it has an interest in. And so this is kind of an older imperial power in the form of Russia that is seen at the time as the stronger power. Japan is the country that kind of represents like the new kid on the block in terms of imperialist societies, and Japan is going to have immediately as the war begins and Japan attacks naval capacity of Russia, we see Japan have the upper hand in this war. It's a particularly gruesome war because the weaponry is very much a product of industrialization. So this is kind of going to give us a sense of what the fighting will be like in World War I. We see quite a few battles over the course of 1904 and 1905 involving both Japan and Russia, and there's high casualty rates and it becomes really significant. There's a lot of fighting that takes place at sea, but there's also a lot of fighting on land in Manchuria and in Korea. So it's a really horrific war. In any case, the United States has an interest in this region. One is the United States has some position on Japan. There is kind of a parallel interest in imperialism that had been happening for the country of Japan and also for the United States. So in a sense, the United States sees Japan as entering into a club of sorts that has largely been European imperialists. So there's some recognition of Japan for that. At the same time, there's a little bit of competition between the United States and Japan over interests in China. And the United States also has an interest in kind of maintaining some type of balance of power or stability in the region so that its interests get protected, interests in the Philippines and interests in China. So the United States is seeking on some levels stability in the region, but also is kind of aware of Japan's interests and also Russia. So there's, a variety of things kind of going on in this war, okay? Just to give you a little bit of an idea, this is just some brief context, very, very broad context about where Japan is at. And of course, we see Japan in this time period at the turn of the century becoming much more industrialized and essentially an imperial power that has its eyes on other societies in Asia. But it wasn't always the case. If we go back to Japan in the 1600s, 1700s, we would recognize a much more feudal Japan, one where the samurai and the daimyo are really, part of this kind of layered society. The political system was under the Tokugawa shogunate, so a lot less power in the hands of an emperor who was seen more as a figurehead. The shogun is the much more significant power, and in this feudal society, there is also a great deal of isolationism in terms of not really seeing Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate as being a society kind of on the global stage. Some of that will end when there's some opening up of trade, such as when the United States, Commodore Matthew Perry lands in Japan. There's some increasing openness to trade that starts to develop, but mostly there's a great deal of internal strife. It's like the feudal system starts to fall apart. Some members of the samurai class, rise up, and we see in the middle of the 1800s, not too far away from the time of the U.S. Civil War, Japan undergoes a coup of sorts where a new political system develops, and we get a constitution at this time, the restoration of an emperor, and for our purposes, this is where we see Japan become much more industrialized. This becomes a Japan that has some imperial instincts, want some additional land and resources to continue industrialization. We see to some degree more westernization of Japan at this time and some more militarism. So increase in military conscription, some increase in something that might be an extensive aspect of the military increasing. So military resources, something that we see also in the United States at this time is this industrialization and a lot of increase in at least the role of the American Navy. Okay, so Japan and the United States, again, have some things in common in terms of being like new imperial players in this global space. There is, however, a great deal of issue that starts to happen between the United States, Japan, and Russia. Okay, so for one, both Russia and Japan fighting a horrific war by 1905. It is not clear that this war will end easily, but both sides kind of want out. It's also fairly clear that Japan is the stronger power in the war, is like winning the war against Russia, which surprises quite a few people. There is also a role for the United States in trying to broker a peace treaty between Russia and Japan. And this starts out with the Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, who later becomes president after Roosevelt. But for a while, he works with Roosevelt and his administration. And Taft meets up with the Prime Minister of Japan, Katsura Toro, and they meet up and secretly meet and decide, basically, that the United States will hold on to the Philippines and Japan will not access that territory. And the United States will look the other way when Japan colonizes Korea. So there is a secret agreement where the United States and Japan kind of start to carve apart parts of Asia. And this is going to have very big significance, especially within Korean history. Teddy Roosevelt will then broker a peace treaty in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And, he's not actually at the treaty, but it's a whole pile of diplomats from both Japan and Russia, and they will debate what will happen as a result of this end of the war. And Japan will put forth its ideas because the diplomats say they won the war. They want Russia to pay for the cost of the war. Russia refuses. Japan would like the Sakhalin Islands, and Russia doesn't want to give them up. So there's a variety of issues that kind of stall the treaty. Arguably, Teddy Roosevelt kind of brokers some compromises, and it's one of these deals where everybody leaves the treaty table and nobody's happy because everybody didn't get what they wanted. But Teddy Roosevelt, kind of does get what he wants because he is trying to broker an end to this war, which doesn't leave Russia completely challenged and doesn't leave Japan with a great deal. They have imperial power, but at the same time, Roosevelt is looking to check some of it. So there is a little bit of a compromise, okay? To give you an idea, in the resulting treaty, and I think Japan benefits much more significantly, Japan gains control of Port Arthur, which was that really extensive warm water port, and they get half of Sakhalin Island. They do not get any of the war costs, something that they really wanted. Japan will have some economic challenges as a result of this war. Russia does agree to evacuate southern Manchuria, which does get restored to China, and Japan does see recognition of Korea. And by 1910, Japan will formally annex Korea in an aspect of colonialism. So we see what happens with the United States and its expanse of colonial powers. We're going to see the same thing with Japan. And so this has a lot of consequences for, again, Korean history. The additional way in which the United States gets involved in this, and we can see this propaganda sign to the right, obviously very, very racist, horrific. This is going to speak to some of the changing climate in California. There had been a great deal of discrimination against Asians in America, especially Chinese, through the Chinese Exclusion Act. But we see increases generally between like the 1860s, 1880s, 1890s. Initially, the United States had a treaty with Japan that promised a great deal of respect for Japanese immigrants. This starts to fall apart in California when there are increases in Japanese immigration. And one of the things that we see is in San Francisco, for example, school segregation. And this includes not only Japanese immigrants, also Korean immigrants, Chinese immigrants. There becomes like widespread school segregation, and it creates a huge issue within Japan. There's actually a lot of press on what's happening to children of Japanese immigrants in California, and there's a lot of editorials, and it becomes a big foreign policy issue, so much so that Teddy Roosevelt actually calls the individual school people and mayor and whatnot from San Francisco and other places in California to insist that the segregation must stop. So it is kind of a contentious issue. The issues over immigration and the treatment of immigrants become something that gives Japan some increased power, in a sense, to be against the United States. So the U.S.-Japan relationship is going to be very affected by these domestic issues. There is a backroom compromise again. So we do get, to some degree, a San Francisco school board and whatnot that will end the segregation. But in exchange for that, Teddy Roosevelt and Japan will negotiate what's known as the Gentleman's Agreement. Unlike the Chinese Exclusion Act, which had been an act of Congress, that there's debate and then there's a definitive law that ends certain immigrants from China to come to the United States, mostly laborers and people coming for particular occupations. There's a few exceptions, but of course the law has a huge impact on the quantity of individuals coming into the United States from China. In this case, we see what's like basically a backroom deal in a set of notes between Japan and the United States. There will be a action on behalf of Japan to limit the number of individuals who leave Japan for the United States. So immigration is going to be dialed way down between Japan and the United States, and this will lend itself to kind of appeasing some of the population in California. So despite the fact that Roosevelt will publicly push back against segregated schools, there is a kind of appeasement for San Francisco, in that there will be a decrease in the quantity of immigrants coming from Japan. And this, again, is known as the Gentleman's Agreement, and it affects Asian immigrants from not only Japan, but we will also see a great deal of where the school segregation issue reflects discrimination, we will see that trend continue. And this is important because later on, when we get to events like World War II and the topic of Japanese internment, we can ask the question in terms